Sometimes the things we've lost find their way back to us when we need them most. Dean Morrow had spent his whole life feeling like he didn't quite belong anywhere. A single dad barely making ends meet, he bought a burned mansion for $400 because it was all he could afford. The place was gutted by fire and forgotten by time. But when he stepped inside and saw a family crest carved above the old hearth, his heart stopped. The name was Morrow. This ruin had belonged to his great-grandparents, a home erased from family memory after some long-ago falling out. Buried under ash were journals and letters that told a story no one had spoken of in generations. What happened here? And why had his family buried this place in silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dean Morrow's alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, same as it had for the past 7 years. He reached across the narrow bed in his studio apartment and silenced it before it could ring a second time. The room was dark, quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette 10 feet away. He sat up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, and planted his feet on the cold linoleum floor. 49 years old, and this was what his life had become. 2 jobs, no savings, and an apartment so small he could touch both walls if he stretched his arms wide enough. But he was standing, he was working, and he was doing it alone, which was more than he could say for some folks his age. He showered, dressed in his work clothes, and made instant coffee in the microwave. By 5:15, he was out the door, driving his 15-year-old truck toward the hardware store on the east side of town. He'd been the morning manager there for 6 years. It didn't pay much, but it was steady. Weekends, he picked up construction work, framing, drywall, whatever needed doing. His hands were calloused, his shoulders perpetually tight, but he never complained. Complaining didn't fix anything. The store opened at 6. Dean unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and started the register. By 6:30, the first customers trickled in. Contractors mostly, men who knew him by name and trusted his advice on lumber grades and fasteners. He liked this part of the job, helping people solve problems, making things work. Around noon, his daughter Kate called. "Hey, Dad, you eating lunch?" "About to," he said, though he wasn't. He'd forgotten to pack anything and didn't want to spend money on takeout. Liar. Go get something. "You need to eat," he smiled despite himself. "Yes, ma'am. I'm serious. You're going to work yourself into the ground." "I'm fine, Katie." There was a pause on the other end. Kate was 24 now, just graduated with a degree in architecture. She had her own apartment across town, a good job with a firm downtown, and a life that was finally taking shape. Dean was proud of her in ways he couldn't quite put into words. She was everything he'd hoped she'd become. Strong, independent, thoughtful. "I worry about you," she said quietly. "I know, but you don't need to. I've got everything under control. Dad, you're working 80 hours a week." "That's not control. That's survival." She wasn't wrong. After his wife left 7 years ago, walked out without much explanation beyond, "I can't do this anymore," Dean had thrown himself into work. Partly to cover the bills, partly to keep his mind occupied. Kate had been 17 then, still in high school, and he'd been determined to give her stability, even if everything else was falling apart. He'd succeeded mostly. She'd graduated, gone to college, built a life. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten to build one for himself. "I'll be okay," he said. "Promise, all right. But I'm coming by Sunday. We're having dinner. Real food. Deal!" After they hung up, Dean stood behind the counter and stared out at the aisles of tools and supplies. His whole life felt like this, functional, organized, but temporary, like he was managing someone else's store, living in someone else's apartment, waiting for something to shift. That night, after his shift ended at 3, and before his construction gig started at 5, Dean sat in his truck in the parking lot and scrolled through his phone. He did this sometimes, looked at real estate listings. Not because he could afford to buy anything, but because it helped him imagine a different version of his life. A house with a yard, a place that felt permanent. Most listings were far out of his range. Modest homes in decent neighborhoods started at 200,000, sometimes more. He had maybe 3,000 in savings. It wasn't enough for a down payment. Wasn't enough for much of anything, but then he saw it. A listing near the bottom of the page marked, "As is no inspections." The price caught his eye first. $400. $400. He assumed it was a typo. But when he clicked through, the description was clear. Fire-damaged estate. Approximately 4,500 SQFT, structural integrity unknown. Sold as is, cash only. Serious inquiries only. There were 3 photos. The first showed a sprawling mansion, or what was left of one. The roof had caved in on one side. The windows were blown out. Scorch marks climbed the stone facade. The second photo showed the front entrance. Massive double doors, hanging crooked on their hinges. The third was an interior shot, all shadows and debris. Dean stared at the images. Something about the place tugged at him. Maybe it was the stone archway over the entrance, or the way the structure still stood despite the damage. Or maybe it was just desperation dressed up as intuition. Either way, he saved the listing. That Sunday when Kate came over for dinner, he showed it to her. "You're joking," she said, staring at his phone screen. "I'm not. Dad, it's a ruin. Look at it. I know what it looks like. Then why are you even considering this?" Dean set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. They were sitting at his tiny kitchen table, eating spaghetti he'd made from a jar of sauce and a box of noodles. It wasn't much, but it was what he could afford. "Because it's $400, he said. "I can't buy anything else." "Not for years. Maybe not ever. But I could buy this," Kate shook her head. "You don't even know if it's livable. It could be condemned. It could be dangerous. I'd check it out first." "I'm not stupid. I didn't say you were stupid. I said this is a bad idea. Maybe, but what if it's not?" She studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You really want this, don't you?" "I want something that's mine," he said. "Something that doesn't feel temporary," Kate sighed. "Where is it?" "Millfield County. About 40 minutes from here. That's the middle of nowhere." "I know." She picked at her spaghetti, thinking. Finally she looked up. "If you're going to do this, I'm coming with you. I want to see it before you make any decisions." Dean smiled. "Deal." The following Saturday they drove out together. The property was listed under a small real estate office in a town Dean had never heard of. The agent met them at a coffee shop, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who seemed surprised anyone had shown interest. "I'll be honest with you," she said. "This place has been on the market for 2 years. Nobody wants it. The fire happened back in '78. It's been sitting empty ever since." "Why?" Kate asked. The agent shrugged. "No idea. The family that owned it just left. Never came back. Eventually, the county took possession for unpaid taxes. They've been trying to unload it ever since." Dean felt that tug again, stronger this time. "Can we see it?" "Sure. Follow me." They drove another 15 minutes down a winding rural road until they reached a pair of iron gates hanging open on rusted hinges. Beyond them, a gravel driveway disappeared into overgrown trees. The agent's car bounced along the uneven path, and Dean followed in his truck. When the mansion came into view, Kate inhaled sharply. It was larger than the photos suggested. 3 stories built from grey stone, with tall windows and a wide front portico. The damage was severe. Half the roof collapsed, the facade blackened, vines crawling up the walls. But beneath the destruction you could still see the grandeur. This had been someone's dream once. Someone's home. Dean parked and stepped out. The air smelled like damp earth and charred wood, even after all these years. The silence was heavy, almost reverent. "It's bigger than I thought," Kate said quietly. The agent handed Dean a flashlight. "Be careful inside. The floors aren't stable everywhere." Dean and Kate approached the entrance. The double doors were unlocked, one hanging loose. He pushed them open and stepped inside. The foyer was cavernous. A grand staircase, half collapsed, rose toward the upper floors. The chandelier that must have once hung above lay shattered on the floor. Soot covered everything. But even in ruin, the craftsmanship was evident. The carved banisters, the high ceilings, the arched doorways leading to other rooms. Dean moved slowly through the space. Kate close behind. They explored the ground floor, a library with charred shelves, a dining room with a long table still standing, a kitchen gutted by flame. Every room told a story of something lost, and then they entered what must have been the great room. Dean's flashlight swept across the space, landing on the far wall. Above a massive stone hearth, partially obscured by soot, was a carved crest. He moved closer, brushing away the grime with his hand, his breath caught. The crest was ornate, detailed, two crossed hammers beneath a rising sun, encircled by a banner. And beneath it, etched into the stone in bold letters, Morrow, 1889, Dean stepped back, his heart pounding. He looked at Kate, who stood frozen, staring at the same inscription. "That's our name," she whispered. "I know. Dad, this can't be a coincidence." Dean's hands were shaking. He pulled out his wallet, retrieved the one photograph he always carried, his father as a child, maybe 5 years old, standing in front of a house Dean had never recognized. He held it up to the light, comparing the boy's face to the shadows of this place. Could it be? "We need to find out who owned this," Kate said, her voice urgent now. Dean nodded, unable to speak. He looked around the room, at the wreckage and the history embedded in these walls, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a ruin. This was a door to something he'd been missing his entire life. He turned to Kate. "I'm buying it. Dad, I have to." She met his eyes and saw the resolve there. After a moment, she nodded. Dean took the following Saturday off from both jobs, a rarity he couldn't really afford, but one he couldn't avoid either. Kate picked him up at 7 in the morning, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and a determined look on her face. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." They drove in comfortable silence, the early light cutting through the trees as they left the city behind. Dean felt a nervous energy building in his chest. Last week he'd seen the crest and felt that shock of recognition, but in the days since doubt had crept in. What if he was wrong? What if the name was just coincidence? What if he was building a fantasy out of desperation? Kate seemed to sense his thoughts. "Whatever we find, we'll deal with it together." He nodded, grateful. When they arrived, the mansion looked different in full daylight, less ominous, more tragic. The stone walls that had seemed almost majestic in shadow now revealed their damage clearly. Cracks running through the facade, sections crumbled away, the skeletal remains of what had been beautiful. They parked and gathered their supplies, flashlights, work gloves, a crowbar, trash bags, and a camera. Kate had insisted on documenting everything. If this place truly was connected to their family, they needed a record. Dean unlocked the front doors, his doors now, strange as that felt, and they stepped inside. The smell hit him again, old smoke, mildew, decay. But beneath it something else, something that reminded him of his grandmother's attic, that scent of old wood and paper and time. "Let's start upstairs," Kate suggested. "If there are any records, personal items, they'd most likely be in the private quarters," Dean agreed. They climbed the damaged staircase carefully, testing each step. The second floor was less destroyed than the first. The fire had apparently started on the ground level and worked its way up before being contained or burning out. Several bedrooms remained relatively intact, their contents buried under layers of dust and debris. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall. The door hung crooked, and Dean had to force it open. Inside, the room was large, with a 4-poster bed frame still standing, a dresser against one wall, and a fireplace opposite. The windows were broken, letting in wind and weather, but the structure held. Kate moved to the dresser, pulling open drawers. Most were empty or filled with rotted fabric, but in the bottom drawer, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, she found something solid. "Dad, look at this." She lifted out a metal lockbox, about the size of a shoebox, surprisingly heavy. The lock was rusted but intact. Dean took the crowbar and worked at it carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. After a few minutes, the lock gave way with a sharp crack. Inside were papers, documents, letters, and a leather journal, all protected from the worst of the damage by the metal box and oilcloth wrapping. Dean lifted the journal carefully. The cover was scorched at the edges but intact. He opened it to the first page. In careful, old-fashioned handwriting, the inscription read, "Property of Silas Morrow." January 1945. Dean's hands trembled. "Silas Morrow." Kate leaned over his shoulder. "Your great-grandfather?" "I don't know. I never knew any names that far back." He turned the pages slowly. The entries were sparse at first. Notes about weather, business dealings, mentions of a mill and lumber contracts. Then around 1946, the tone shifted. "Chester has betrayed everything we built. I cannot fathom how my own brother could do this." Dean read the words aloud, his voice barely steady. Kate pulled out her phone and started photographing each page. More entries followed, each more desperate than the last. "The accusations are lies. I have done nothing wrong, yet the town believes them. Chester has seen to that Iris is frightened. The children ask questions I cannot answer. How do I tell them their uncle has destroyed us? They have taken the mill. The courts ruled against me without evidence, only testimony from men Chester paid. I have no recourse." The entries ended abruptly in 1947. "We leave tomorrow. This house, this land, it is all we have left, but we cannot stay. The town has turned against us. Chester and his allies have won. I leave this record in hope that someday someone will know the truth. We were not thieves. We were betrayed." Dean closed the journal, his throat tight. He looked around the room. This bedroom, this house, had belonged to his great-grandfather, a man who'd been driven out by his own brother, a man whose name had been erased so thoroughly that Dean's own father had never spoken of him. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Dean's voice cracked. "Why didn't Dad ever say anything about this?" Kate sat down on the dusty floor, processing. Maybe he didn't know. Or maybe it was too painful. Dean opened the other documents in the box. There were letters, mostly between Silas and his wife, Iris. One from Iris, dated 1946, spoke of her faith in her husband, her determination to keep the family together. Another, from someone named Geneva, expressed sympathy and outrage at the injustice. At the bottom of the box was a photograph. Dean lifted it carefully. The image was faded but clear. A family portrait taken in front of this very mansion. A man in his 40s, tall and serious, stood beside a woman in a long dress. 3 children sat in front of them, 2 girls and a boy, the youngest maybe 7 or 8 years old. Dean turned the photo over. On the back, in pencil, "Silas, Iris, and our children. Summer 1940. He studied the boy's face, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw. Then he pulled out his wallet and retrieved the old photograph of his father as a child. The resemblance was unmistakable. "That's him," Dean whispered. "That's my dad." Kate took both photos, held them side by side. "Oh my God, Dad, this is real. This house, it's ours. It was always ours." Dean felt something break open inside him. All his life he'd felt unmoored, like he had no roots, no history worth knowing. His parents had been distant, secretive. When his father died 5 years ago, he'd left no stories, no family tree, no explanations. Dean had assumed there was nothing to know, that his family was just ordinary people who'd lived ordinary, forgettable lives. But this was something else entirely. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the estate. The land stretched for acres, overgrown and wild, but still there, still standing. "They took everything from him," Dean said quietly. "His business, his reputation, his home. And then they erased him from history. Like he never existed." Kate joined him at the window. "But he did exist. And now you know," Dean turned to her. "What do I do with this?" "We find out the rest," she said firmly. "We find out what really happened. And we make sure people know the truth." Dean looked back at the journal, at the letters, at the photograph of his great-grandfather standing proud in front of this house. A house that had been stolen, a legacy that had been buried. He thought of his father, who'd carried this shame in silence, who'd never felt worthy of claiming his own history. "I'm going to restore this place," Dean said, the words coming out with unexpected conviction. "Not just the building, the name, the truth, all of it." Kate smiled, her eyes bright. "Then let's get to work." They spent the rest of the day searching the house, cataloging what they found. More letters, more documents, pieces of a story that had been hidden for 70 years. With each discovery, Dean felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders, not a burden, but responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Silas and Iris, about his father, about every Morrow who'd been denied their history. As the sun began to set, Dean and Kate stood in the great room beneath the family crest. The words carved in stone seemed to glow in the fading light. Dean reached out and traced the letters with his fingers. "I promise," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the house, to his ancestors, or to himself. "I'll bring you home." Kate put her hand on his shoulder. "We will." They locked up and drove back to the city in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, purposeful, determined. Dean had spent his whole life feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. Now, he knew why. He'd been looking in the wrong places. His home had been waiting here all along, buried under ash and lies, waiting for someone to come back and reclaim it, and he would. 2 weeks passed in a blur of research and revelation. Dean requested time off from his weekend construction job, something that cost him money he couldn't afford to lose, but the pull of the mansion was stronger than financial prudence. Every spare moment, he found himself either at the estate or buried in documents at the county records office. The records office was a cramped building downtown, staffed by a woman named Beatrice Cordero, who looked to be in her late 50s. She had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that suggested she'd seen every kind of person come through those doors. When Dean first explained what he was looking for, she'd raised an eyebrow. "The Morrow property? That old place out past Millfield?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'm trying to trace the ownership history." Beatrice had studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Let me see what I can pull." She disappeared into the back rooms, returning 20 minutes later with a stack of files and ledgers. "Most of this has been digitized, but the older records are still on paper. You'll need to sign in and handle them carefully." Dean spent hours poring over the documents, photographing pages with his phone, taking notes. Kate joined him when she could, her architectural training making her especially useful at interpreting old property. Surveys and building permits, what they discovered, painted a troubling picture. The Morrow family had owned 300 acres, including the mansion, from 1889 to 1948. The property records showed steady ownership through 3 generations. Silas Morrow had inherited from his father in 1920 and held the deed until February 1948. Then, abruptly, the property transferred to the Fairmont family for $1,200. Dean stared at the transfer document. $1,200 for 300 acres and a mansion. Even accounting for the era, it was absurdly low. "Something's wrong here," he said to Beatrice, who'd been checking on him periodically. She leaned over to look at the document. "What do you mean?" "This price, it's too low." Properties like this, even back then, would have been worth 20 times this amount. Beatrice pulled out a calculator, did some quick math, and nodded slowly. "You're right. That's well below market value for 1948. She paused. "Let me check something." She disappeared again, this time for nearly half an hour. When she returned, she carried another file. No mortgage records. No liens, no outstanding debts recorded against the property. According to everything here, Silas Morrow owned it free and clear. She set the file down. "So why would he sell for so little?" "He wouldn't," Dean said. "Not voluntarily." Beatrice looked at him carefully. "The Fairmont name still carries weight around here. They owned the lumber mill back then. Employed most of the county at one point or another. What happened to the mill?" "Still operating, actually. Different owners now, but the Fairmont family held it until the 80s. She hesitated. "If you're digging into old family business, you should be careful. Some folks don't like having the past disturbed." Dean thanked her and left with copies of everything she'd allowed him to reproduce. That evening, he spread the documents across the floor of his apartment and tried to piece together a timeline. 45. Silas Morrow's journal entries showed everything was fine. The mill was profitable. The family was stable. Turn 46. The tone shifted. Accusations. Betrayal by his brother Chester. 47. Legal troubles. Loss of the mill. Public disgrace. 948. For sale of the property. The family disappeared from all records after that. Dean's father had been 8 years old when they lost everything. The next Saturday, Dean and Kate returned to the mansion with tools and a plan. They decided to catalogue everything systematically, room by room. Kate brought her camera and a notebook. Dean brought work gloves and determination. They started in the attic, a space they hadn't thoroughly explored yet. The stairs were treacherous, half-rotted in places, but they made it up safely. The attic was enormous, running the full length of the house, with dormers letting in pale light. Boxes and trunks lined the walls, most damaged by water and time. But in the far corner, wrapped in a tarp that had somehow stayed mostly intact, they found a steamer trunk. Dean dragged it to the center of the room and opened it carefully. Inside were more personal effects, clothing, books, a child's toys. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth like the journal had been, a bundle of letters. Kate lifted them out gently. The paper was yellowed but readable. The letters were correspondence between Silas and his brother Chester, dated from 1945 to 1946. Dean read them aloud, his voice growing quieter with each one. The early letters were cordial, discussing business matters. The brothers had been partners in the mill, it seemed. Silas handled operations and labor relations. Chester managed finances and investor relations. Then the tone changed. Silas, I must insist you review the quarterly statements I sent. There are discrepancies that concern me. Chester, I have reviewed them. The numbers you're citing don't match my records. We need to discuss this in person. You're accusing me of dishonesty? After everything I've done to secure our investors, I'm asking for clarity. Nothing more. The final letter from Chester was brutal. You've made your choice, brother. You've chosen your pride over our family's future. When the truth comes out, and it will, don't expect me to defend you. You've brought this on yourself. Dean set the letter down, his hands shaking. He set him up. His own brother set him up. Kate was reading another letter, this one from someone named Geneva Pruitt. Dad, listen to this. This woman, she was writing to Iris, Silas's wife. She says the accusations against Silas were false, that Chester had been embezzling and blamed it on Silas when investors started asking questions. Dean took the letter, read it himself. Geneva wrote with outrage and sympathy, apologizing that she couldn't do more to help, that the town had already made up its mind. Chester destroyed him, Dean said. And then he took everything. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the betrayal settling over them. What happened to Chester? Kate asked. I don't know. But I'm going to find out. That evening Kate went home, but Dean stayed. He'd started doing that, spending nights at the mansion, sleeping in the servants' quarters, which was the only room on the ground floor that was reasonably intact. He'd brought a sleeping bag, a camping stove, some basic supplies. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt right, like he was standing guard over something precious. He sat in the great room that night, a lantern casting shadows on the walls, and stared at the family crest above the hearth. The crossed hammers, the rising sun. The name that was his name, Silas Morrow, had built something here. A home, a legacy, and his own brother had destroyed it. Dean thought about his father, who'd grown up in this house as a child, who'd lost it all before he was 10 years old, who'd carried that loss his entire life without ever speaking of it. What kind of shame did that take? What kind of pain? Dean stood and walked to the hearth. He placed his hand on the stone, still cold from the night air, and made a silent promise. He would find the truth, all of it, and he would make sure the Morrow name meant something again. Not revenge, not bitterness, just truth, and maybe, if he was lucky, something like redemption. 3 weeks into the project, Dean made a decision that surprised even himself. He gave notice on his studio apartment. Kate thought he was crazy. Dad, you can't live in that place full-time. It's not safe. The servants' quarters are solid, he argued. I've checked the structure. The roof's intact over that section. I'll save $800 a month in rent, and if the whole thing collapses on you... It won't. She'd stared at him, jaw tight, then finally sighed. You're impossible. I'm practical. You're stubborn, but she'd helped him move anyway. They'd transported his meager belongings in 2 truckloads. A bed frame, a small dresser, his clothes, his father's old toolbox. Everything fit easily in the servants' quarters, which was larger than his apartment had been. The room had a fireplace, a small attached bathroom with plumbing that miraculously still worked, and windows that looked out over what had once been gardens. Dean set up a camping stove for cooking, brought in a cooler for food, and hung a lantern from the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was his. And more than that, it was home in a way nowhere else had ever been. Kate visited after work most evenings, bringing dinner or helping catalog items. They developed a routine, work on the mansion, research the history, piece together the story of what had happened to Silas and his family. One evening, as they were clearing debris from the library, they heard a truck pull up outside. Dean went to investigate and found an older man standing in the driveway, hands in his pockets, looking up at the mansion with an expression somewhere between nostalgia and sadness. "Help you?" Dean called out. The man turned. He was in his late 60s, weathered skin and grey hair, wearing work clothes that had seen better days. "You the fellow who bought this place?" "I am." "Dean Morrow." The man's eyebrows rose. "Morrow? Well, I'll be." He walked closer, extending a hand. "Porter Vance. I live about 5 miles down the road." They shook hands. Porter had a grip like iron. "I remember this house when I was a boy," Porter said, gazing up at the facade. "It was something to see back then, like a castle. You remember the family who lived here?" Porter nodded slowly. "Not well. I was young. But I remember the summer it all went to hell. One day the mansion was full of life. The next it was empty. Nobody talked about why. We just knew the Morrows were gone." Dean felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "What did people say about them?" Porter considered the question. "Depends who you asked. Some folks said Silas Morrow was a cheat, that he stole from the mill workers. Others said he was framed. My grandfather worked at the mill. He always said Silas was a fair man, treated his workers decent." Porter paused. "After the Fairmonts took over, things changed. Wages dropped. Safety got worse. My grandfather lost his job a year later when he complained about conditions. The Fairmonts still around." "Oh, sure. They don't own the mill anymore, but they've got plenty of money. Big house on the north side of town. Constance Fairmont, she's the current matriarch. Old money, old power." Porter looked at Dean carefully. "If you're digging into what happened back then, you should know. Some people won't appreciate it. I'm just trying to understand my family's history." Porter nodded. "Fair enough. But watch yourself." He gestured at the mansion. "You need help with this place. I've got time and I know my way round a toolbox. Can't pay much, but I'd be willing to lend a hand." Dean was surprised by the offer. "Why would you do that?" "Because this place deserves better than to rot away. And because my grandfather would have wanted someone to remember the truth about Silas Morrow." Porter smiled slightly. "Besides, I've got a grandson who needs to learn some skills. Might be good for him." They shook hands again, and Porter left with a promise to return Saturday morning. That night, Dean was going through another box of documents when he found something that stopped him cold. It was a hand-drawn family tree, carefully rendered on a large sheet of paper, now yellowed and brittle. The tree started in the 1850s with names Dean didn't recognize. Silas's grandparents, then his parents. Branches extended down through the generations. Silas and his brother Chester, their children. Silas's 3 children were listed with birth dates. The youngest was William Morrow, born 1938, Dean's father. But the tree ended there. No marriages recorded, no next generation. Just William's name and birth year, and then nothing. Dean traced the lines with his finger, feeling the weight of erasure. Whoever made this tree, probably his grandmother, had stopped recording their family after they lost the house. As if the Morrow line had ended in 1948, even though it hadn't. He thought about his own childhood. His father had been distant, quiet, rarely spoke about his past. Dean had grown up assuming there was nothing to tell. But now he understood. His father had carried this shame, this loss, his entire life. He'd buried his history because acknowledging it was too painful. Kate arrived with pizza and found Dean sitting on the floor, the family tree spread out in front of him. What's that? He showed her. She knelt down beside him, studying it. They just stopped, she said softly. Like the family ended, but it didn't end. My dad grew up. He got married. He had me. So why isn't any of that recorded? Dean folded the paper carefully. Because by then, being a Morrow meant shame. It meant being the family that fell from grace. It meant carrying a legacy of disgrace that wasn't even true. Kate was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we should make a new one. A new what? A new family tree. One that shows the whole story. You, me, everyone who came before and everyone who comes after. Dean looked at her, this daughter who'd become his anchor, his partner in this strange resurrection of their family. Yeah, we should. Later that night, after Kate had gone home, Dean walked through the mansion by lantern light. He'd started doing this every evening, a kind of patrol, a way of checking on the house, of feeling connected to it. He stopped in what had been the nursery. The room was small, cozy, despite the damage. Against one wall, he'd found something earlier that he hadn't shown Kate yet. Children's height marks, carved into the doorframe. Margaret, 1938, Chester Jr., 1939, William, 1940, his father's name. Carved when he was 2 years old. Dean stood there, staring at the marks, and imagined his father as a toddler, standing against this frame while someone, his mother probably, marked his height. A simple family ritual, done in love, in a house that should have been his inheritance. Dean reached out and touched the carved letters. I'm here, Dad, he whispered. I found our way home. The house creaked around him, settling into the night, and for the first time in his life, Dean Morrow didn't feel alone. 6 weeks into the restoration, the mansion began to show signs of real progress. Porter and his grandson, a quiet young man named Benny, had been coming every Saturday. Together, they'd managed to patch the worst of the roof damage, clear the debris from 3 rooms, and secure the unstable sections of the second floor. The work was slow but steady, and Dean felt something like pride watching the place come back to life. He'd burned through most of his savings and taken out a small loan, something that made him nervous. But Kate had insisted on contributing a portion of her salary each month. This is my history too, she'd said firmly when he tried to refuse. The town of Millfield had begun to notice the activity. People drove by slowly, staring at the mansion that had stood silent for so long. Some waved, others just watched. One afternoon, as Dean was working on clearing the garden path, a silver Mercedes pulled up the driveway. A woman stepped out, elderly, maybe early 70s, wearing an expensive coat and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that came from generations of privilege. Mr. Morrow? Her voice was crisp, cultured. Dean set down his rake and walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. That's me. I'm Constance Fairmont. She extended a gloved hand. I live in town. I wanted to introduce myself. Dean shook her hand, immediately wary. The Fairmont name had appeared in every dark corner of his research. Nice to meet you. Constance looked up at the mansion, her expression unreadable. I remember this place from when I was a girl. It was magnificent once. I'm working on bringing it back. So I see. She turned to him. I'll be direct, Mr. Morrow. I'd like to make you an offer for the property. $50,000. That's more than fair for a building in this condition. Dean kept his face neutral. It's not for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price. $60,000 then. Ma'am, with respect, I'm not interested in selling. Constance's pleasant expression cooled slightly. This property has a complicated history. I'm not sure you understand what you're taking on. I understand perfectly. Do you? She studied him carefully. Sometimes the past is better left buried. Digging it up serves no one. Dean felt anger rising but kept his voice level. The past isn't buried. It's right here in this house. And I have every right to learn about my own family. Constance was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone was harder. The Fairmont family has deep roots in this community. We've been generous to this town for generations. I'd hate to see that goodwill disrupted by someone stirring up old, unsubstantiated accusations. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just restoring my family's home, for now. She pulled a business card from her purse and handed it to him. If you change your mind about selling, call me. The offer stands for 30 days. She got back in her car and drove away, leaving Dean standing in the driveway, his heart pounding. That evening, he told Kate what had happened. Her reaction was immediate fury. She threatened you. She made a suggestion. Dad, that was a threat. She's worried about what you might find. Or she just wants the property. Kate shook her head. Nobody offers $60,000 for a burned-out mansion unless they're desperate to control something. What else have you found? Dean had been spending his lunch breaks at the library, diving deeper into the historical records. The librarian, Geneva Pruitt, had warmed to him over the weeks. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, with a protective love for local history. There's a restricted collection, Dean said. Geneva mentioned it. Documents that aren't available to the general public. Can you access it? I asked. She said she'd think about it. 2 days later, Geneva called him at the hardware store. Mr. Morrow, can you come to the library after work? There's something I'd like to show you. Dean arrived at 4:30, just as the library was closing to the public. Geneva locked the front door and led him to a back room he'd never seen before. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a table in the center was already covered with boxes. What you're looking for, Geneva said, is in here. But before I show you, I need you to understand something. The Fairmont family has been good to this town. They've donated money to schools, funded the hospital wing, sponsored community events. They're respected, I understand. What I'm about to show you could change that. Dean met her eyes. I'm not looking to hurt anyone. I just want to know the truth about my family. Geneva nodded and opened the first box. Inside were newspaper clippings carefully preserved. The headlines made Dean's stomach turn. Mill workers strike, owner accused of wage theft. Morrow under investigation. For embezzlement, former benefactors fall from grace. The articles painted Silas as corrupt, greedy, responsible for the town's economic troubles in the late 1940s. But Geneva pulled out another set of documents. Letters, financial records, meeting minutes from the mill's board of directors. These weren't in the newspapers, she said. The official story was that Silas Morrow embezzled from the workers' pension fund. But look at this. She showed him a series of financial transfers, documented in meticulous detail. Money had been moved from the pension fund, but the signatures authorizing the transfers were Chester Morrow's, not Silas's. Chester was embezzling, Dean said slowly, and when the workers started asking questions, he blamed Silas, worked with Alistair Fairmont, Constance's grandfather, to build a case against him. False testimony, manufactured evidence. The town believed it because Chester was charming and because the Fairmonts backed his story. Dean's hands shook as he went through the documents. Why wasn't Silas charged? Because there wasn't enough real evidence to make it stick in court. But court didn't matter. Public opinion destroyed him. The Fairmonts bought the mill and the Morrow estate for pennies on the dollar. Chester got a payout and left town, and Silas lost everything without ever being formally accused of a crime. Dean sat down heavily. My great-grandfather was innocent, completely. And my grandfather, who also worked at the mill, knew it. He tried to speak up, lost his job for it. A lot of men who defended Silas were pushed out. Geneva's voice was sad. The truth got buried because the people with power wanted it buried. Dean looked at the pile of documents. Can I make copies? I'll do better than that. I'll testify to what I know, if it ever comes to that. Why are you doing this? Geneva smiled slightly. Because history matters. Because truth matters. And because I'm old enough that I don't care who I upset anymore. Dean left the library with a folder full of copies, his mind reeling. He drove back to the mansion and found Kate waiting for him on the front steps. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said. Worse, I've seen the truth. He showed her everything. They sat in the servants' quarters, going through each document, each piece of evidence that proved Silas's innocence and Chester's betrayal. What are you going to do? Kate asked. Dean thought about Constance's visit, her veiled threat. He thought about his father, who'd carried shame that wasn't his to carry. He thought about the Morrow name, buried in lies for 70 years. I don't know yet. But whatever I do, it needs to be right. That night he couldn't sleep. He walked through the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, and stopped at the hearth in the great room. Someone had spray-painted the word thief across the family crest. Crude letters in black paint dripping down the stone. Dean stared at the vandalism, anger and sadness warring in his chest. His great-grandfather wasn't the thief, but someone wanted the lie to survive. Dean reported the vandalism to the police the next morning. Officer Fritz Brenner arrived an hour later, a man in his mid-40s with a skeptical expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "You see anyone?" Fritz asked, photographing the spray-painted crest. "No. Happened sometime during the night." "Security cameras?" "Don't have any." Fritz wrote something in his notebook. "Not much to go on. Could have been kids. This place probably attracts trouble just sitting out here. Or it could have been someone who doesn't want me here." Fritz looked at him. "You having problems with folks in town?" Dean considered mentioning Constance's visit, but decided against it. "Nothing specific." "Well, I'll file a report, but I'll be honest. Chances of finding who did this are slim." Fritz handed him a card. "You see anyone suspicious, give me a call." After Fritz left, Dean stood alone in the great room, staring at the defaced crest. The word mocked him, this lie that had defined his family for generations. He thought about cleaning it off, but something stopped him. Maybe he needed to see it, to remember what was at stake. The next few days were difficult. Dean noticed subtle hostility in town, cold shoulders at the hardware store, refused service at the diner where he'd occasionally grabbed breakfast. Word had spread about what he was doing, and not everyone was pleased. Kate was furious when she heard. "They have no right to treat you like this. They're protecting their version of history," Dean said. "I'm threatening that by telling the truth. Truth can be dangerous when people have built their whole identity on a lie." Despite the tension, the restoration continued. Porter showed up every Saturday without fail, and his loyalty meant more than Dean could express. One morning, as they worked together replacing rotted floorboards in the dining room, Porter shared his own connection to the story. "My grandfather, Vernon Vance, worked at the mill for 20 years, Porter said, hammering a nail with practiced precision. "He was foreman under Silas Morrow. Always said Silas was the fairest boss he ever had. What happened to him after the takeover?" "Fired within 6 months. The Fairmonts brought in their own people, cut wages, ignored safety complaints. Vernon tried to organize the workers, got blacklisted. Struggled for years after that." Porter paused. "My father grew up poor because Vernon stood up for what was right. I guess that's why I'm here. Some debts get passed down just like some lies do." Dean felt the weight of that, generations carrying the consequences of one family's betrayal. "I'm sorry about your grandfather. Nothing to be sorry for. He made his choice, and he was proud of it. I am too." That afternoon, Dean was sorting through items in the master bedroom when he found a small wooden box tucked in the back of the closet. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The paper was delicate, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were clear. The letters were from Iris to Silas, written during the height of the accusations in 1947. Dean sat on the dusty floor and read them, his throat tight. "My dearest Silas, whatever they say about you, I know the truth. I have always known you are the most honest man I have ever known, and I will stand beside you through whatever comes. The children ask questions I cannot answer. How do I explain to them that their uncle has betrayed us? That the town we helped build has turned its back on us? I tell them we will endure because we have each other, and that is more valuable than any property or reputation. They can take our home, our business, our standing in this community. But they cannot take who we are. Our name will endure, my love. Somehow it will endure. Forever yours." Iris. Dean read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision. This woman, his great-grandmother, had possessed extraordinary strength. She'd believed in her husband when no one else would. She'd kept her family together through exile and disgrace. He carefully folded the letter and carried it downstairs to show Kate, who'd arrived after work with groceries. She read it silently, wiping her eyes when she finished. She was remarkable. She was. And she was right. The name did endure. "We're still here. What are you going to do with all this?" Kate gestured at the documents they'd accumulated, the evidence of injustice, the proof of innocence. I've been thinking about that. Dean leaned against the counter. I could expose everything, show the town what really happened, destroy the Fairmont family's reputation, but you won't. No, because that's not why I'm here. I didn't come here for revenge. I came here to find my family, and I did. The restoration, it's not just about the building. It's about reclaiming dignity, about showing that the Morrow name means something good. Kate nodded slowly. So what's the plan? We finish the restoration. We document everything, the history, the truth, all of it. And then we share it, but not as an attack, as a story. A story. And if the Fairmonts don't like it? Dean thought about Constance's veiled threats, about the spray-painted crest. Then they'll have to deal with it. But I'm not going to let fear of their reaction stop me from honoring my family. That evening, Porter stopped by with Benny, who'd been mostly silent during their work together, but had proven himself capable and hard-working. Tonight, though, Benny spoke up. Mr. Morrow? I wanted to tell you something. The young man shifted awkwardly. My friends in town, some of them have been saying stuff about you, about how you're lying about your family, trying to stir up trouble. Dean felt his stomach sink, but kept his voice calm. What do you think? I think if you were lying, you wouldn't be working this hard. My granddad says you're doing right by your family, and I trust him. Benny looked at the mansion. This place was something once. It deserves to be something again. Dean was moved by the simple statement. Thank you, Benny. That means a lot. After they left, Kate suggested documenting the restoration process more formally. I've been taking photos, but we should do more. Video interviews, a timeline of what we've found. If we're going to tell this story, we should tell it right. You thinking about a presentation? I'm thinking about an open house. Once the restoration is further along, we invite the town. Show them what we've done, share the history. Let people see the truth for themselves. Dean considered it. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. That could go badly, or it could go well. Either way, it's honest. And that's what matters, right? He smiled. When did you get so wise? I learned from my dad. That night, Dean couldn't sleep. He walked through the mansion in the darkness, thinking about everything that had happened in these rooms. The joy and the betrayal, the love and the loss. He stopped in front of the vandalized crest, the word thief still stark against the stone. He made a decision. Tomorrow he'd clean it off, not because he was erasing what happened, but because he was reclaiming what belonged to his family. The lies had lasted long enough. It was time for the truth to stand in the light. Dean spent a morning carefully cleaning the spray paint from the family crest. The work was tedious, requiring gentle chemical treatments to avoid damaging the stone. When he finally stepped back, the crest gleamed, not perfect but restored enough that the carved letters stood proud again. He was admiring his work when Kate arrived with news. I found something online, an old legal notice about estate sales in 1948, and it mentioned that Silas Morrow had secured a safety deposit box at Riverside Bank before leaving town. The box was prepaid for 100 years. Dean's pulse quickened. Riverside's only 20 minutes away, I called. They still have records going back that far. If the box exists and we can prove you're a direct descendant, they might let us access it. They drove to Riverside that afternoon, Dean's hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The bank was a sturdy brick building on Main Street, unchanged for decades. Inside, they met with the manager, a woman named Phyllis Carver, who looked to be approaching retirement. A safety deposit box from 1948? Phyllis adjusted her glasses and typed into her computer. Let me check our archives. She disappeared into a back room for what felt like forever. When she returned, she carried a thick ledger. Box 247, registered to Silas Morrow, prepaid through 2048. She looked up. Nobody's accessed it since it was opened. Dean felt his heart hammering. Can we see it? I'll need proof of lineage. Birth certificates, death certificates showing direct descent. Kate pulled out a folder they'd prepared. Copies of Dean's birth certificate, his father's death certificate, the family tree they'd found, the documents from the county office. Phyllis reviewed everything carefully, made some phone calls, consulted with someone else at the bank. Finally, she nodded. Everything appears in order. Follow me. They descended stairs to the vault, an underground room with walls of safety deposit boxes. Phyllis used 2 keys, one hers, one from the original registration, and opened box 247. Inside was a metal document box, surprisingly heavy. Phyllis led them to a private room where they could examine the contents. Dean's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were papers, photographs, and a sealed envelope addressed simply "To whom it may concern." Kate started photographing everything immediately, while Dean carefully sorted through the contents. There were financial records, detailed ledgers showing transactions at the mill from 1945 to 1947. Dean's eye caught on several entries, highlighted in red ink, transfers from the Workers' Pension Fund, each one authorized with a signature, Chester Morrow's signature. "Look at this," Dean said, his voice barely steady. He showed Kate a series of documents, bank statements, forged authorizations, correspondence between Chester and Alistair Fairmont discussing how to redirect attention from our activities. The evidence was damning. Chester had embezzled nearly $50,000, an enormous sum in the 1940s. When the mill's accountants started asking questions, Chester had preemptively accused Silas, planting false evidence and leveraging Alistair's influence to make the accusations stick. There were photographs too, Chester and Alistair at social events, grinning at the camera, partners in crime disguised as pillars of the community. Notes in the margins of some documents showed they'd planned to divide the assets. The Fairmonts would take the mill and the land, Chester would get a substantial payout and relocate. And at the bottom of the box, the sealed envelope. Dean opened it carefully. Inside was a letter in Silas's handwriting, dated March 1948. "To whoever finds this, I write this knowing my family's name has been destroyed by lies. My brother Chester, in partnership with Alistair Fairmont, has stolen everything we built and blamed me for his crimes. I have proof of their betrayal, documented here in full. I could fight. I could take this evidence to the authorities, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. But I have seen what fighting costs. My wife is exhausted. My children are confused and frightened. The town has made up its mind, and I have learned that truth matters little when those in power decide otherwise. I choose to leave, not because I am guilty, but because I will not sacrifice my family's well-being to salvage my reputation. Perhaps that makes me a coward, or perhaps it makes me a father who understands that some battles are not worth the casualties they demand. I leave this evidence for my descendants, if any remember us. You owe nothing to my memory, and I expect no vindication. But if you seek truth, here it is. What you do with it is your choice to make. I hope you choose wisely." Silas Morrow Dean read the letter aloud, his voice cracking. When he finished, he and Kate sat in silence. "He knew," Kate finally said. "He had proof all along, and he walked away. He chose his family over justice. Was he right to?" Dean thought about that. About his father, who'd grown up in exile but had grown up safe, protected from the ugliest parts of the battle. About himself, who'd known nothing of this history until now. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I understand it. They made copies of everything, returned the originals to the box, and drove back to the mansion in silence." Dean's mind churned with possibilities and responsibilities. He had proof, incontrovertible evidence that would vindicate Silas, expose Chester's betrayal, and reveal the Fairmont family's role in a conspiracy that had destroyed his family. What was he supposed to do with it? That evening, Kate made the argument he knew was coming. "We have to share this. The truth has to come out. And what does that accomplish? The people responsible are dead. Constance wasn't even born when this happened, but she's benefiting from it. The Fairmont family built their wealth on stolen property and lies, and exposing that destroys her. Maybe her whole family, for something she didn't do." Kate was frustrated. "So we just let the lie stand?" "I didn't say that. I just need to think about the right way to do this. There's only one right way. Tell the truth." Dean looked at his daughter, seeing his own anger and righteousness reflected back at him. But he also saw something else in himself, Silas's weary wisdom, the understanding that truth without mercy could be its own kind of cruelty. "Give me a few days," he said. "Please," Kate reluctantly agreed. That night, Dean sat alone in the great room, Silas's letter on his lap, the evidence folder beside him. He thought about power and justice, about revenge and healing. He thought about what it meant to honor the dead, whether it was by vindicating them or by choosing a different path than the one they were forced to take. Finally, he made a decision. He would confront Constance Fairmont privately. He would show her the evidence and give her a chance to acknowledge the truth. What happened after that would depend on her response. It was a risk. She could deny everything, use her influence to discredit him, make his life even more difficult. But it was the right thing to do. Silas had chosen mercy over justice. Maybe Dean could choose both. He picked up his phone and called the number on Constance's business card. "Mrs. Fairmont, this is Dean Morrow. I need to speak with you about our family's history. I have something you need to see." The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the mansion. Constance had agreed without hesitation, though her voice on the phone had been cautious. Dean suspected she knew this conversation was coming. He spent the week preparing. Kate helped him organize the documents into a clear presentation, financial records, photographs, letters, the timeline of events. They set up in the dining room, which Porter and Benny had just finished restoring. The long table was perfect for laying out evidence. Faye Whitlock, the property lawyer Dean had consulted about the easement claim, agreed to be present as a witness. "If this goes where I think it's going," she'd said, "you'll want someone there who can verify what was discussed." The morning of the meeting, Dean woke early. He walked through the mansion, checking the progress they'd made. The transformation was remarkable. The roof was solid now. The floors were safe. 3 rooms were fully restored, and the rest were clean and structurally sound. The staircase had been rebuilt, the windows replaced, the walls scrubbed of soot. Kate arrived at noon with sandwiches. Neither of them felt like eating. They went over their approach one more time. "Let me do most of the talking," Dean said. "This needs to be calm, not confrontational. What if she denies everything?" "Then at least we tried." Constance arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, driving herself in the same silver Mercedes. She was accompanied by her lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s named Gerald Ashton. They parked and approached the house, Constance looking up at the restored facade with an expression Dean couldn't quite read. He met them at the door. "Mrs. Fairmont, thank you for coming. Mr. Morrow." She shook his hand formally. "This is my attorney, Gerald Ashton. My daughter Kate and my attorney Faye Whitlock." They moved to the dining room. Dean had arranged chairs on both sides of the table. The documents were spread out in organized stacks, face down for now. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Water?" Dean asked. "No, thank you." Constance settled into her chair, her posture perfect. "I assume this isn't about selling the property." "No, Mom. It's about what happened here in 1948. Constance's expression tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Dean began. He spoke calmly, laying out what he'd discovered. The journal, the letters, the financial records from the library. He explained the accusations against Silas, the forced sale, the family's exile. "I know this is your family's history too," he said. "Your grandfather was involved. I wanted you to know what I've found before deciding what to do with it." Constance listened without interrupting. Her lawyer took notes. When Dean finished the initial explanation, he started turning over the documents, first the newspaper clippings, then the financial records from Geneva's restricted collection. Gerald examined them carefully. "These could be authenticated?" "They're from the county library's archives," Faye said. "Geneva Pruitt, the head librarian, has verified their provenance." Dean continued, showing the evidence of Chester's embezzlement, the correspondence between Chester and Alistair Fairmont. With each document, Constance's face grew paler. Finally, Dean laid out Silas's letter and the contents of the safety deposit box. "Your grandfather and my great-uncle conspired to frame an innocent man," Dean said quietly. "They stole his business, his property, and his reputation. My family has carried that shame for 3 generations." Constance stared at the documents for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was strained. I had no idea. I believe you. She looked up sharply. Do you? Yes, you weren't born when this happened. You're not responsible for their choices. Gerald cleared his throat. What exactly are you asking for, Mr. Morrow? Right now, nothing. I wanted Mrs. Fairmont to see the truth. What happens next depends on several things. Such as, Constance asked. I won't let you use false legal claims to take this property. The easement your lawyer mentioned, we both know it's questionable at best. Constance glanced at Gerald, who shifted uncomfortably. We can discuss withdrawing that claim. Good. Beyond that, I haven't decided what to do with this information. I could go public, expose everything. But I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in truth and in making sure my family's name is cleared. Constance was quiet for a long moment. May I speak with you privately? Dean glanced at Kate, who looked uncertain but nodded. Faye and Gerald exchanged glances. Then the lawyers and Kate stepped out of the room. Alone with Constance, Dean waited. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the estate. My grandfather built everything on a lie. Yes. Our family's reputation, our wealth, our standing in this community, it's all tainted. That's one way to see it. She turned. What's the other way? You're not your grandfather. What you do now defines your family, not what he did 70 years ago. What would you have me do? Dean considered carefully. Acknowledge the truth. Help me clear my family's name. We don't have to destroy yours in the process, but I won't let the lie continue. And if I refuse, then I take this to the newspapers, the Historical Society, anyone who'll listen. Your family's legacy becomes one of theft and conspiracy. Constance closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was pain there and something like respect. You're giving me a choice my grandfather never gave yours. I'm trying to do better than the men who came before us. That's admirable. She returned to her chair. I need time to process this. But I won't fight you on the property, and I won't try to suppress the truth. You have my word. How do I know I can trust that? You don't. But I suspect we both understand that trust is earned through actions, not promises. They called the others back in. Constance instructed Gerald to drop the easement claim immediately. She shook Dean's hand before leaving, holding his gaze. I'll be in touch, she said. Thank you for handling this with dignity. After they left, Kate let out a breath she'd been holding. That went better than I expected. We'll see, Dean said. She could still change her mind, but somehow he didn't think she would. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Porter and Benny increased their hours, sensing the project was reaching a crucial phase. Other volunteers from town began appearing, people who'd heard about the restoration and wanted to help. A woman donated period-appropriate furniture. A man offered to restore the gardens. The local historical society expressed interest in featuring the mansion. Kate threw herself into planning the open house. We'll do it in 6 weeks, she said. That gives us time to finish the major restoration and create a proper historical exhibit. Dean agreed, though the thought made him nervous. Exposing his family's story to the entire town felt vulnerable in a way he wasn't sure he was ready for. One afternoon, Kate brought him to the library. She'd been working on something in secret, and now she revealed it, a new family tree, beautifully calligraphed on archival paper, extending from the 1850s down through Silas. His father, Dean, Kate, and blank spaces for future generations. We'll hang it next to the original, she said. Show that the family didn't end, it continued. We're still here. Dean stared at the tree, overwhelmed. His name, right there in ink, connected to generations of Morrows who'd come before. He wasn't alone. He'd never been alone. It's perfect, he managed. That evening, he walked through the mansion one more time. The transformation was undeniable, light-filled rooms that had been dark for decades. The air smelled of fresh paint and wood polish instead of ash. The family crest gleamed above the hearth, restored and proud. Tomorrow they'd begin setting up for the open house. The town would come, some to support, some to judge, some simply curious. Whatever happened, Dean was ready. He'd found what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not just a house, but a home. Not just a name, but a legacy worth claiming. The morning of the open house arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Dean woke before dawn in the master bedroom, his bedroom now, and lay still for a moment, listening to the house settle around him. After 3 months of constant work, the mansion felt alive again. The floors didn't creak ominously. The windows let in light instead of wind. The rooms held warmth. He rose and dressed carefully. Clean jeans, a button-down shirt Kate had insisted he buy. Today mattered. Today, the world would see what they'd built, and more importantly, they'd see the truth about the Morrow family. Kate arrived at 7 with Porter and Benny. They'd spent the previous day setting up, but there were still last-minute details. Chairs arranged in the great room, refreshments in the kitchen, the historical exhibit in the parlor, carefully curated to tell the story without sensationalism. The centerpiece was a timeline Kate had created, mounted on boards that stood against the wall. Photographs, documents, and narrative text traced the Morrow family from 1889 through the present. The exhibit didn't shy away from the accusations or the exile, but it presented the evidence clearly. Silas had been innocent, framed by his brother and the Fairmont family. At the entrance, they'd placed an old guest book Dean had found in the attic. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed. The first entry was dated September 1889, the mansion's opening celebration. The last entry was from December 1947, just months before the family left. Kate had cleaned it carefully and set it on a pedestal with blank pages ready. "People can sign it again," she'd said. "Start a new chapter." Geneva Pruitt arrived at 8, bringing members of the Historical Society. She'd been instrumental in verifying the documents for the exhibit, and her presence lent credibility that Dean knew he needed. "The mansion looks beautiful," Geneva said, walking through the rooms with obvious emotion. "I remember what it looked like before the fire. You've brought it back." "We've tried," Dean said. "You've succeeded." By 9 o'clock, the first visitors began arriving. A trickle at first. Curious townspeople who'd driven past the mansion for years and wanted to see inside. They moved through the rooms cautiously, as if stepping into a museum. Dean greeted everyone at the door, thanking them for coming, inviting them to explore. The reactions were mixed. Some people seemed genuinely moved. Others remained skeptical, their expressions guarded. A few made pointed comments about stirring up old business or rewriting history. Dean responded to each with courtesy, never defensive, always gracious. By noon, the trickle had become a steady stream. Families with children, elderly couples, young professionals from town. The great room filled with quiet conversation. People signed the guest book, their names joining those from a century ago. Kate gave informal tours, pointing out architectural details, explaining the restoration process. She avoided pushing the historical narrative, letting people read the exhibit at their own pace. Dean noticed many visitors spent long minutes studying the timeline, reading the documents, comparing the newspaper accounts with the evidence of Silas's innocence. Around 1 o'clock, a group of elderly residents arrived together, people who remembered the mansion from their childhood. Dean recognized one woman immediately from the photograph Porter had shown him. Her name was Opal Hutchins, and she was 83 years old. She walked through the entrance and stopped, tears filling her eyes. "Oh my, it's just as I remembered." Dean approached carefully. "Mrs. Hutchins? You must be the Morrow boy. Porter told me about you." She took his hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I knew your great-aunt, Margaret Morrow. We were playmates before." She paused, composing herself. "Before everything happened. Would you tell me about her?" Opal smiled through tears. "Well, she was kind, gentle, she loved to read. We'd sit in the library for hours." She looked toward the restored library. "May I?" "Of course." Dean walked with her, Kate following with a camera. Opal stood in the doorway of the library, taking in the restored shelves, the furniture arranged much as it had been. "This is where we'd hide when the adults had parties," she said softly. "Margaret would read to me. She was older, maybe 13 to my 8. She treated me like a little sister." Opal turned to Dean. "When they left, no one would tell me why. One day she was here, the next she was gone. I asked my parents, but they wouldn't explain. Just said the Morrows had moved away. Did you believe what people said about my great-grandfather? Opal shook her head firmly. My father didn't, and neither did I. He worked at the mill. He knew Silas was honest. When the accusations came, my father said it was lies, but no one would listen. She looked at the exhibit visible through the doorway. I'm glad the truth is finally coming out. Margaret deserved better. They all did. Kate asked permission to record Opal's memories, and the elderly woman agreed. They spent 20 minutes in the library, while Opal shared stories. Christmas parties at the mansion, summer picnics on the lawn, the kindness of the Morrow family to everyone in town. They were good people, Opal said finally, and they were destroyed for no reason except greed and lies. I'm glad you came back, young man. I'm glad this house has a Morrow in it again. After Opal left, Dean stood alone in the library for a moment, overwhelmed. This was why he'd done it. Not for revenge or vindication, but for this, for people like Opal, who remembered the truth and had waited 70 years for someone to acknowledge it. The afternoon brought more visitors. The journalist from the local paper arrived, interviewed Dean and Kate, photographed the exhibit. A family donated an antique chair that had originally belonged in the mansion, purchased at an estate sale decades ago. Someone else brought photographs from the 1930s, showing the mansion in its glory. But the largest crowd gathered around 3 o'clock, drawn by word spreading through town. The great room was packed, people spilling into the hallway and other rooms. The energy was curious, anticipatory. And then Dean saw her. Constance Fairmont stood in the doorway alone, wearing a simple dress rather than her usual formal attire. The room quieted as people noticed her, a ripple of whispers spreading through the crowd. Dean's heart hammered, but he walked forward calmly. Mrs. Fairmont, thank you for coming. She met his eyes, her expression unreadable. May I look around? Please. The crowd parted as Constance moved through the mansion. She paused at each room, studying the restoration. When she reached the parlor and the historical exhibit, she stood for a long time, reading every document, every piece of evidence. Dean didn't follow her. He stayed in the great room, greeting other guests, but he was acutely aware of her presence, of the weight this moment carried. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes, Constance returned to the great room. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing something significant was about to happen. She approached Dean, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then Constance turned to face the assembled townspeople. I'd like to say something if Mr. Morrow will allow it. Dean nodded, his throat tight. Constance took a breath, her composure perfect despite the visible emotion in her eyes. Most of you know my family. The Fairmonts have been part of this community for generations. We've taken pride in that legacy, she paused. But I've recently learned that pride was built on a foundation of lies. The room was utterly silent. My grandfather, Alistair Fairmont, conspired with Chester Morrow to frame Silas Morrow for crimes he didn't commit. They stole this property, destroyed a good man's reputation, and forced his family into exile. I didn't know this until Mr. Morrow showed me the evidence, but ignorance doesn't excuse the harm done. Constance's voice remained steady, though Dean could see the effort it took. I cannot undo what my grandfather did. I cannot give back the years the Morrow family lost. But I can acknowledge the truth publicly, and I can apologize, she turned to Dean. On behalf of my family, I'm deeply sorry for the injustice done to yours. Silas Morrow was an honorable man who deserved better. Your family deserved better. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another. Dean felt every eye in the room on him, waiting for his response. He stepped forward, extending his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Fairmont. That took courage. They shook hands, and the room erupted in applause. Not everyone joined in. Dean noticed several people standing with arms crossed, unconvinced, but the majority responded with respect for what they'd just witnessed. Constance wasn't finished. She walked to the guest book at the entrance and signed her name, writing a longer note beside it. When she stepped back, people crowded around to read what she'd written. Constance Fairmont, November 2025. In acknowledgement of truth too long buried, and in hope that this house will stand as a testament to justice, delayed but not denied. She turned back to the crowd. The Fairmont family will make a donation to the Millfield Historical Society to ensure this story is properly documented and preserved. We will also establish a fund to support the continued restoration of this estate." She looked at Dean. "If Mr. Morrow will accept it." Dean was stunned. That's generous. "Thank you. It's the least we can do." After Constance left, to another round of applause, the energy in the mansion shifted. What had been cautious curiosity became genuine celebration. People who'd held back now approached Dean with stories, with support, with offers to help. Porter found him in the crowd and clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it, son. You really did it. We did it," Dean corrected. "None of this would have happened without you." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversations and connections. The journalist asked for a follow-up interview. Geneva proposed a partnership between the mansion and the Historical Society for educational programs. Several people left contact information, wanting to contribute to future restoration efforts. As evening approached and the crowd began to thin, Kate found Dean standing on the front porch, looking out over the estate. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet. It doesn't feel real." "It's real, Dad. You brought our family home." He put his arm around her shoulders. "We brought them home." They watched the last visitors leave, cars pulling away down the long driveway. The mansion stood behind them, lights glowing in the windows, looking like it must have looked 100 years ago when Silas and Iris lived here. Porter and Benny stayed to help clean up. They worked together quietly, putting away chairs, storing the refreshments, straightening the exhibit. It felt right, this small group that had become something like a family, caring for the house together. Around 8 o'clock, Porter and Benny said their goodbyes. "Same time next Saturday?" Porter asked. "Same time," Dean confirmed. "There's still plenty to do." After they left, Dean and Kate stood in the great room beneath the family crest. The word thief was long gone, the stone cleaned and restored. The crossed hammers and rising sun gleamed in the lamplight. "I keep thinking about Silas," Dean said quietly. "How he walked away from all this to protect his family. How he left that evidence but never used it. He made the choice he had to make, and I got to make a different choice. I got to see justice done without losing what mattered." Dean looked at his daughter. "That's because of you. You pushed me to do this right." Kate smiled. "You would have figured it out. Maybe, but it would have taken longer." They walked through the mansion one last time that night, turning off lights, making sure everything was secure. In each room, Dean felt the presence of those who'd come before, not as ghosts, but as family, as people who'd loved this place and lost it, and somehow, across the generations, brought it home again. In the library, Kate paused at the new family tree hanging beside the original. "Do you think Silas would be proud?" Dean studied the names, the lines connecting past to present to future. "I think he'd be relieved that someone finally told the truth, that the name survived. It did more than survive. It's thriving again." They locked up and stood on the front steps, breathing in the cool night air. The stars were bright above them, the same stars Silas would have seen standing in this exact spot. "What happens now?" Kate asked. "Now we keep going. Finish the restoration, live in it, make it a home again." "And the story?" "Geneva wants to do a historical presentation. The journalist wants to write a feature. People are going to ask about this for a long time." Dean thought about that. "We tell it honestly. We don't hide from it, but we don't let it define everything either. The Morrows were more than what happened to them. They were people who built something beautiful, people who loved each other, people who survived." Kate nodded. "People like us." "Yeah, people like us." They stood there for a few more minutes in comfortable silence. Father and daughter, watching their home, because it truly was home now, settle into the night. Finally, Kate headed to her car. "I'll be back tomorrow. We should start planning where to put that furniture Mrs. Henderson donated." "Sounds good." "Drive safe." Dean watched her taillights disappear down the driveway, then turned back to the mansion. He wasn't tired yet. Probably too much adrenaline from the day. He went back inside to the master bedroom and opened the drawer where he kept his most precious finds. The journal, the letters, the photographs. He pulled out Silas's pocket watch, found just a week ago, tucked in a coat pocket. The engraving on the back read, "Time reveals all truth." Dean opened the watch, checked the time, even though it had stopped working decades ago, and smiled. "You were right," he said softly to the man who'd owned this watch, who'd lived in this house, who'd suffered and endured and ultimately made the hardest choice a father could make. Time did reveal the truth. It just took a while. He set the watch on his nightstand, turned off the light, and lay down in the bed that had once been Silas's, in the room that had once held so much heartbreak, in the house that finally, after 70 years, belonged to the Morrows again, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Dean Morrow fell asleep feeling like he was exactly where he belonged. 3 months had passed since the open house, and autumn had given way to winter. Snow dusted the mansion's grounds, transforming the estate into something from a storybook. Dean stood at the kitchen window, watching morning light glint off the white landscape, and marveled at how much had changed. The mansion was fully functional now. Heat flowed through restored radiators. Water ran clear from every tap. The rooms he and Kate had spent months cleaning and repairing were furnished, lived in, warm. This was no longer a restoration project. It was home. Dean had quit his weekend construction job and reduced his hours at the hardware store. The Fairmont family's donation, combined with contributions from townspeople and a small grant from the Historical Society, had provided enough financial cushion that he could breathe for the first time in years. He'd even started consulting on historic restoration projects for other properties in the county, putting his hard-earned expertise to use. Kate had been accepted to a graduate program in historic preservation at the State University. She'd be starting in the fall, and Dean couldn't have been prouder. The work they'd done together had shaped her future in ways neither of them had anticipated. "This is what I want to do," she'd told him when the acceptance letter arrived. "Help people reclaim their history. Show them that the past isn't just something to bury or forget." This morning, she was bringing someone to meet him, a young man she'd been seeing for a few months. Dean had met him briefly once before, a quiet architect from her firm named Colin, but this visit felt more significant. She'd called it bringing him to the family home, and the phrase had made Dean's heart swell. They arrived around 10, Kate's car crunching up the snow-dusted driveway. Dean met them at the door, shaking Colin's hand and ushering them inside where it was warm. "The place looks incredible," Colin said, looking around with professional appreciation. "Kate's shown me photos, but seeing it in person is different." They gave him a tour, Kate pointing out details with the pride of someone who'd helped build something meaningful. Colin asked thoughtful questions about the restoration process, the historical elements they'd preserved, the decisions they'd made about modernization versus authenticity. In the library, now fully restored, with shelves of books both salvaged and donated, Colin paused at the family trees hanging side by side, the original from 1952 and the new one Kate had created. "This is beautiful," he said. "The way you've connected past to present." Kate glanced at her father, smiling. "It was important to show the line didn't break, that we're still here." After lunch, Colin excused himself to take a work call, leaving Dean and Kate alone in the great room. They sat near the restored hearth, a fire crackling in the fireplace that had once been covered in soot and spray paint. "He seems like a good man," Dean said. "He is." Kate hesitated. "I wanted to ask you something. The Historical Society wants to host events here. Educational programs, tours, maybe even weddings. Geneva thinks it could help with ongoing maintenance costs. What do you think?" "I think this house was meant to be full of people. It was never meant to sit empty and silent." Dean considered that. The mansion had been built for gatherings, for family, for life. Keeping it to himself seemed selfish, a waste of everything they'd worked to restore. "Let's do it," he said. "But we do it right. No turning it into some commercial venue. Keep it dignified. Keep the history at the center." Kate grinned. "Geneva will be thrilled." That evening, after Kate and Colin left, Dean walked the property alone. He'd started doing this regularly, a kind of meditation, a way of connecting with the land and the history it held. The gardens, which Porter and Benny had helped clear, were dormant now but ready for spring planting. They'd found old landscape plans in the attic and intended to restore them properly. He stopped at a spot near the edge of the property where a small family cemetery had been hidden by overgrowth. They'd discovered it 2 months ago, weathered headstones dating back to the 1890s. Silas and Iris were buried here, along with other Morrows from earlier generations. Dean had cleaned the stones, repaired what he could, and ensured the area was protected. He stood before Silas's grave, the stone simple but elegant. Silas Morrow, 1889–1962, beloved husband and father. Your grandson, my father, he never told me about you, Dean said softly to the stone. I think carrying what happened was too heavy for him. But I found you anyway. Found all of you. And I want you to know the name means something again. People know the truth now. Your family is home. And imagined it was an answer, an acknowledgement, maybe even approval. He walked back to the mansion as dusk settled over the estate. Lights glowed in the windows, his lights, in his home. The sight never got old. That warmth and welcome, where there had once been only darkness and ruin. Inside, Dean made dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, and ate at the long dining room table. He thought about all the meals that had been shared here over the decades, all the conversations and laughter and ordinary moments that made a house a home. His phone buzzed. A text from Kate. Thank you for today. Colin loved the house. Love you, Dad. Dean smiled and typed back, love you too, Katie. See you Sunday. He cleaned up, banked the fire, and walked through the mansion one more time before bed. In each room, he turned off lights, checked windows, made everything secure. These nightly rounds had become ritual, a way of caring for the place that had given him so much. In the master bedroom, he picked up Silas's pocket watch from the nightstand. He'd had it repaired, and it ticked softly now, keeping perfect time. Time reveals all truth. Dean opened the watch, checked the hour, and set it back down. He thought about his father, who died never knowing his grandson would reclaim what had been lost. He thought about Silas, who'd sacrificed everything to protect his family. He thought about all the Morrows who'd come before and the ones who would come after. $400 had bought more than a burned mansion. It had bought connection to the past, to family, to something larger than himself. It had bought purpose and meaning and a place to finally, truly belong. Dean turned off the light and looked out the window at the snow-covered grounds, at the land his great-grandfather had loved and lost, and that now, somehow, had found its way back to where it belonged. We're home, he whispered into the darkness. Finally, we're home. And in the quiet of that old house, full of history and heartache and hope, Dean Morrow closed his eyes and rested, exactly where he was always meant to be.